Sorry, I got cut off. But basically, when you're planning learning targets, you want to create these objectives or goals that align with the action verbs in Bloom's taxonomy, both for an entire unit plan and then individual lesson plans. For our purposes, you're going to be thinking about writing at least 1 or 2 learning targets for your one lesson plan. And so this ABCD method of writing a learning target is a really helpful suggestion when thinking about how to clearly articulate the audience, the students, their behaviors or the action. So, what is it you want them to do? So here is to identify in a particular lesson. The condition refers to the what. What are they doing? So identifying 3 causes of the American Revolution. And the degree means at what proficiency level do you expect your students to achieve at the end of your lesson? And this is really hard to gauge. It could be 3/4 of the class. It could be most students, 95%, 80%, however you want to phrase it. But I wanted to at least show you this method of writing learning targets because they need to be measurable. When planning your social studies instruction, learning targets need to align to the standards, needs to align to the content and skills you are teaching, but also need to be measurable, meaning how can you identify understanding? Or assess for understanding. That's pretty vague. But if you say something really specific and using examples from Bloom's taxonomy with these action verbs, it's much clearer to be able to assess and evaluate the degree in which students can achieve and meet learning targets when using specific action verbs and being really clear about what it is you want them to achieve. So it should be pretty straightforward in trying to evaluate whether or not 95% of students can identify 3 causes of the American Revolution if you're teaching the 8th grade Georgia standards. Some other things to consider when we're planning activities for lesson plans: you write your learning target, you have the goal you want them to achieve, you have the standard connection. Now you need to think about how you are going to choose strategies and activities for students to complete in these lesson plans where they can demonstrate what they're learning and measure their proficiency in achieving learning targets. So they need to align. Your lesson plans should, to the best of your ability, try to align to that C3 framework of asking a question. And for an entire unit plan, again, a compelling question is much more open-ended and can have multiple interpretations and perspectives. Individual lesson plans should have specific essential questions that can be answered at the end of the teaching. So again, aligning with being measurable. If you are going to ask them about 3 causes of the American Revolution, then one of those causes could be about, let's say, the Boston Massacre. So having a specific essential question for students to answer in that particular one specific lesson plan. And how can they answer these questions and meet these learning targets? By offering students primary and secondary sources as evidence to examine and to investigate in order to answer essential questions for a specific lesson, to answer compelling questions for an entire instructional unit, to be able to explain key vocabulary, and to practice historical thinking and research skills by identifying historical contexts and perspectives in order to discuss significance and conclusions of this historical content or the geography content or economics content that you were teaching, in order to ultimately lead students to discuss the compelling question, but also to deliberate on how they can take informed action. So if we're talking about the American Revolution and the Stamp Act, what's this got to do with life in the 21st century? Well, this could be a chance for students to look at the primary and secondary source evidence, and we're going to talk about how we use these sources in the next chapters 5 and 6 and so forth when promoting reading and writing and investigation in social studies, but really being mindful of how we can plan activities that engage students in analyzing documents and evidence to explain their understandings, to explain significance of historical content in order to discuss how they can take an informed action in the present. If to teach contemporary and contemporary social studies as a professional educator means to think about how we plan our instruction that promotes engagement and democratic citizenship. How do we help and support our young learners in becoming active and engaged pro-social citizens? And that's why planning is really important. And so Chapter 3 then goes through, again, aligning to the C3 framework, highlighting different kind of instructional modes that you can employ, whether it be a delivery mode where it's more direct instruction, maybe planning lectures or formal presentations to provide students with basic information and background knowledge of new topics and skills you will be teaching. But also our chapter highlights access mode of teaching, or planning more student-centered strategies using group work and cooperative learning activities like doing structured debates or discussions, hands-on activities, in order to, again, engage students in applying what they're learning from these documents and these primary and secondary sources, from their textbooks, from other prepared resources that you have, in order to deliberate and come to conclusions about the significance of this content and how it can connect to promoting democratic citizenship and informed action in their communities. Chapter 4 then talks about assessment. And so it's really important that when you're teaching your standards and the content and skills that you are organizing for each lesson plan that you teach on a daily basis, that connects very clearly to what you are assessing students on and how you're going to assess them. Remember that assessment refers to the actual tool you use to provide feedback to students and to gather data on student strengths and areas where they need improvement, where the evaluation is the judgment, if you will, on how students did. So if the assessment is, a document-based question, student gets 90% out of 100% questions correctly on that assignment, the evaluation is that 90%. That evaluation includes the feedback you give students in terms of, again, what did they do well? Where are they excelling? Where do they need to improve? And to try to give feedback to students that they can ideally use to help them be able to achieve the objectives in your learning target, for your standards. And there are so many different types of assessment that we can give in social studies. It can be pretty creative. Assessments, again, are the tools to measure proficiency. So again, making sure the learning targets are measurable, and the evaluation is the feedback we give to students based on the assessment data. And in social studies, we can give many different types of formative or informal assessments by checking for understanding while we teach. These are things that may not have a formal grade or evaluation. So it could be a discussion, it could be an exit ticket, it could be a journal entry, it could be thumbs up, thumbs down, doing polls of students to see what they're learning, what they think, what they know, what they want to know. A summative assessment is that more formal assessment with a grade and an evaluation, where we're checking to see, did students meet or exceed the learning objectives? Did they master proficiency of a standard, or do they need extra help? And so these things tend to be a little bit more high stakes, but it could be a test, it could be an essay, it could be a report, it could be an essay. It's something that you would give feedback to students, again, to help them understand what they need to do to identify their strengths, to achieve learning targets that you have set for students, and to also help students set their own goals in your class in terms of what they want to learn, what they need to learn, and how they will get there to achieve those goals. But Chapter 4 also highlights the purpose and the various advantages to authentic assessment in social studies. which can be quite summative as well. But an authentic assessment in social studies, or any subject area for that matter, is one that is more goal-centered, on the part of the student, where students may be learning about the American Revolution, but going beyond just identifying 3 causes of the revolution, trying to set a goal about explaining, let's say, why the revolution happened, or what is the lasting impact of the actions of the colonies from the 1770s. It's more goal-centered, coming from the students. An authentic assessment tends to look at the bigger picture and process of what students are learning. So where a test comes at the end of a unit and it's a snapshot of everything you taught, an authentic assessment shows more about the progress that students are doing throughout the unit plan and each day of the lessons that you are teaching. So in other words, it's kind of like a portfolio. It can be a collection of artifacts of various different projects students do. It might be, instead of a very formal test or a very document-driven essay, it could be a project or a collaborative effort in which students are working to solve a real-life problem through historical analysis, or looking at the various content areas in social studies as it relates to the standards. Authentic assessment is very much promoted in the C3 framework, with having students to think about a compelling question to activate their prior knowledge, to connect to a content area in social studies, finding the primary and secondary sources as evidence to help them answer questions that either you ask students, or they create themselves, in order to demonstrate their skills and knowledge and to take informed action. And there are several examples of this kind of authentic assessment in social studies on page 72, which might be some good examples for you as you're planning your lesson plan. And with any kind of assessment that you do, particularly a summative assessment, whether it be a more traditional test or quiz, or a more authentic assessment like a portfolio or a project in social studies, you need to have a rubric that breaks down the criteria for students of what they're being graded on, and also to use an appropriate rubric for feedback. And an analytic rubric is typically one that is that breaks down an assignment or an assessment into specific components, so students can see how they're being graded. Where a holistic rubric is one that's a little bit more broad, and you're grading the assessment as a whole. And here are some examples of what I mean by an analytic rubric versus a holistic rubric. An analytic rubric, let's say for breakfast in bed, is breaking down the evaluation of this preparation of a meal in bed or breakfast in bed based on the food quality, the presentation of the meal, and the comfort of the person who's going to eat the meal, with a criteria of 4 performance indicators going from a beginner to exemplary. Whereas with a holistic rubric, if you were going to evaluate a breakfast in bed presentation, you would be looking at the meal as a whole. So instead of breaking it down by I'm grading the food, I'm grading the comfort, I'm grading the presentation, you're looking at the whole thing together. And so you don't have that breakdown of specific criteria and performance indicators. There are some examples of assessment in social studies. You can access these links in this PowerPoint that are located in the week 3 module on Canvas. And what you are going to be working on this week is to think about these chapters on planning and assessment, and thinking about how you can plan your procedures of how you would open your lesson, how you would implement direct instruction, how you can plan activities that students can do in a work period or as a structured practice, and how you will close the lesson. So this part 2 depends greatly on what you planned for part 1. I will be working on that feedback as I evaluate that lesson plan part 1 that you submitted. And please read the next chapters for next week.